ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
The last time Geraldine Brooks was on Conversations, she was discussing her novel Horse, which had just come out. That book was adored by readers and became another bestseller and prize winner, following on from Geraldine's earlier novels, which include The Year of Wonders and March, for which she won the Pulitzer Prize. But at the very time that Geraldine was travelling the world, talking to journalists and giving public readings about horse skeletons and 19th century race trainers, she was nursing an awful private grief. In 2019, Geraldine's beloved husband, Tony Horwitz, in the middle of his own book tour, collapsed on the street and died. Geraldine's new book is a memoir. Memorial Days tells the story of her and Tony's loving, funny, intellectually rich marriage, and how she finally let herself be with the grief of his death, alone on an island in Bass Strait. Hi, Geraldine.
Hi, Sarah.
There's a really beautiful photo of you and Tony on the back cover of Memorial Days. Can you describe it?
It's my favourite photo of the two of us. It just captures a moment that I think expresses what it was like in our life. We're sitting at our kitchen table and he's just said something funny. I am sure of it. And I'm just looking at him with appreciation for his wit and humour. And he's looking down sheepishly because maybe it was something slightly naughty that he said, which would not be out of character.
What sort of sense of humour did Tony have?
Oh, he had an amazing sense of humour. He could not stand anything pompous. And so he was very good at puncturing that. In some ways, it was quite an Australian sense of humour because it was very piss-taking. And he just bounced ideas around and could see the absurdity in every situation.
When the two of you weren't laughing together, what kind of things did you talk about? What was the subject of conversation around that kitchen table?
We were pretty obsessed with politics, actually. Both of us, I think one of the reasons that we came together as a couple was we're both pretty left-wing, and journalism school, we had both on a whim signed up for a business reporting class because we wanted to smash capitalism. And we thought we'd better understand it in order
You've still got some work to do, Geraldine.
I know, it's very slow business, the old smashing capitalism. So Tony had come to journalism school from a job as a union organizer in Mississippi, where he was trying to get fair pay for poor and mostly black pulpwood haulers who were a very oppressed class of people. So he arrived at journalism school pretty stressed out from that undertaking and with a fierce sense of social justice and a peptic ulcer.
Do you remember the first moment that you saw him?
I do remember that quite vividly. It was in the first week of Columbia Journalism School's program, and one of the classmates had invited everybody to a party at her apartment on the Upper West Side, and we're on a balcony, and there's this cute blonde guy, and he is regaling the group with the story of the difficulties of living downtown in Alphabet City, which in the early 80s was a very rough part of New York. It's now not, but at that point, he'd just learned that he needed to take his battery out of his car before he left it because he'd had to buy his battery back twice from the local kids who just took the battery, gave it to the local spare parts dealer, and you had to buy it back. So I thought that was very amusing. And the next day we had a big assembly in what's pompously known as the World Room in Columbia Journalism School. And it's a big auditorium, and I saw him across the room and I waved and he didn't wave back. And I thought, well, cute, but not worth worrying about. And so I didn't give him another thought until we, in the second semester, reconnected in this. And then I found out that he hadn't waved back because the night before he'd been out carousing with his brother at Danceteria and he'd dropped his glasses down the toilet, so he couldn't even see me waving at him.
Well, that's an excellent explanation. So after doing this business class together, you started seeing one another, but where were you headed after graduation? What were your plans?
Yeah, well, it wasn't super convenient because I'd already been offered a job with the Wall Street Journal, and the job was in Cleveland, Ohio. And Tony was headed to the West Coast on the promise of an internship with a newspaper out there. So it looked like this might just be a graduate school fling without a lot of future to it. But on the way west, he stopped in Cleveland, Ohio, and we had a fantastic weekend. And lucky for me, the radio in his car clapped out just as he was leaving the city limits on Monday morning. So he had the entire drive across the expanse of the United States to reflect on what a great weekend we'd just had. And in a few weeks, he turned around and came back.
So did you live together straight away?
We didn't live together. He couldn't find a job in Cleveland. They just closed one of the local newspapers, so the closest job he could find in journalism was 4 hours away in Fort Wayne, Indiana. So we commuted on weekends. And then when we decided pretty quickly to get married, I was heading back to Australia because my dad was very sick and I wanted to spend time with him. And actually, it became a bit of an issue with the Australian immigration authorities because they didn't believe we were really a thing because we'd never lived together.
Well, you did then get married in France. Why France?
My sister, Darlene, had a place there that had always been very special to me. It was on a beautiful hillside outside a village in the perfume-growing area of southern France, and it had just been a romantic place that we'd always loved. The two of us went there first when we were having a bit of a trip around Europe together, and I was only 19. And then we stayed in the basement of the local police, the gendarme's house, and just fell in love with this Tourette-sur-Loup, its beautiful medieval perch town. And we were both inclined to not have a big wedding, and if you do it at short notice in France, it kind of thins out the guest list.
Who did the catering?
We did. My sister and I cooked it.
What did you cook, Geraldine?
Oh, we cooked coronation chicken and something with crevette, and beyond that, the deponent saith not. I can't remember.
You talk about the jobs that Tony had done before he went to journalism school. How good was he at speaking to people, strangers?
Oh, fantastic. I mean, that was his superpower. And he spoke to everybody. He didn't care if you were a big macha from industry or politics or a celebrity, or if you were a toothless, tattooed bikie in a dive bar. He just ran towards conversation. He loved to understand what made people tick, what had created them into the opinions they held, why they saw the world the way they did.
And was that the secret of the kind of journalism, the kind of writing that he did, that ability to meet people and talk to them that way?
That, I think, and underneath the incredible humor was an intensely serious moral purpose. He was very alert to the fact that there were great divisions in American society, and he had been probably destined to be a historian. He was a history major at university and a very gifted one, and probably would have gone on to become a history professor if his social justice instincts had not been so finely honed. So he saw the way America was fracturing, had always been fractured on racial lines, but this increasing income inequality and the divisions between urban and rural. And really it was his life's work to chronicle that. He got his Pulitzer Prize for national reporting by looking at the absolutely dire conditions of low-wage work in America in poultry plants and waste management, and the places right at the bottom where you can work for 40 hours a week, hard labor, and still be desperately poor because the paycheck is so negligible.
In 1987, you and Tony were living in Sydney when you got a call from the Wall Street Journal offering you a new role. What was it?
Well, this was a little crazy, actually. So the Journal, after Cleveland, when I came back to Australia, they rehired me to open their first Australasian bureau, and that was a great adventure. I got to, because they'd never had a correspondent, they had no idea what I should be doing, so I could go on the last great cattle drove in Western Queensland if I felt like it, or delivering supplies to remote Aboriginal communities by barge and adventuring. And I'd just been to New Zealand to do a piece on the quite advanced state of climate research there because of studying the greenhouse gas methane. And they do that very well in New Zealand because sheep are great emitters of methane, and as we know, there are a lot of sheep there. So I'd been following climate scientists scrambling up verdant hillsides, and that piece had appeared that day in the Wall Street Journal, and the foreign editor called me that night, and I had no idea. I picked up the phone in trepidation because she never usually called me. I wasn't very important to her. And I thought, she's going to fire me for putting too many farting sheep jokes in the Wall Street Journal. But she was offering me the Middle East correspondence job.
How much did you know about the politics and history of the Middle East at that point?
Not enough. It was a very steep learning curve, and we only had a month before we had to take up the assignment. Luckily, I managed to find an incredible Egyptian-Australian guy who crash-coursed colloquial Egyptian Arabic, and he was hilarious because every lesson planned for us was about something that would go wrong for us in Cairo and the vocabulary we would need. And he turned out to be exactly right. And just, you know, as you know, it's a fire hose of events in the Middle East. And my first year, I was just sitting on planes with big briefing books on my lap, you know, doing Yemen 101.
So why were you tapped on the shoulder for that role, do you think?
It's a bit of a mystery to me, but I'm afraid that in journalism it often happens that way. I mean, it would be better, you know, if they tapped somebody who actually knew something. But the foreign editor had a very interesting take on that when I expressed to her that I felt overwhelmed and underqualified for the role. And she said, "You will never be closer to the reader than you are when you know nothing. And so you'll ask the questions that they would ask."
What about Tony? How did he feel about moving to Cairo?
Well, you know, it was a tough call for him because he had a great job at the Sydney Morning Herald, and the Journal was not offering two positions. They kind of sort of dangled the opportunity for him to freelance with perhaps a staff job down the road. So it was a big risk that he took. But he was an adventure junkie too, and it actually suited him enormously being in the Middle East because there was nothing he wouldn't do. No ferry boat being shelled in Beirut harbor that he would hesitate to get on. No taxi driving to the front lines of the Iran-Iraq war. No dry cleaner in Saudi Arabia that he wouldn't bribe to get a uniform so that he could pass himself off as a soldier and get to the front lines and liberate Kuwait.
He really did that?
He did that.
So were you covering similar stories at the same time?
We were often working on the same story, but from the opposite sides. So I'd be in Iraq and he'd be in Saudi Arabia, or vice versa, or I'd be with the Palestinians and he'd be with the Israelis, or whatever. And, or, you know, occasionally if it was a big, big story, we'd both be in the same country at the same time.
You were both in Yemen once at the same time.
We were in Yemen at the same time. That was pretty amusing. I mean, because I had the staff job, I had to do the gotta have it stories, like the head of state interview, which is usually a complete waste of time because nobody gets to be a head of state by telling a Western journalist anything significant. But you'd sit around dressed up in a silk suit in a royal palace waiting to be lied to while Tony was off in the top floor of a mud brick castle in Yemen chewing cut with a Sufi mystic.
It sounds more fun, I got to say.
Definitely more fun. I was very envious of him because I had the paycheck and the fancy title, but he had the adventures.
Who had the stronger work ethic, him or you?
Oh, he did. I mean, I'm a decently hard worker, but he was an incredibly driven person. And, you know, occasionally you'd come out of Iran after working 3 days straight without really getting any sleep because the visa was short and you hardly ever got a chance to be there. And I would say, can we just take a nap before we start writing this story? And he'd say, no, we have to file it now.
Did you let him edit your writing?
Oh, yeah. We both edited each other. We were both each other's first and last editor. We would bounce ideas off each other, and then we'd report together, even if it was the other one's story, just to be another pair of eyes and ears, hoovering up details that would be useful, and then nothing left the house without being read and critiqued, and often savaged.
His courage and character were on display in your time there. What did he do when you were driving on a bus through one of the battlefields of the Iran-Iraq War in the late 1980s?
That was an amazing moment where I just saw what he was really made of. It had been a terrible, terrible battle. It was like antique warfare where these human waves of Iranian teenagers just rushed the guns of Iraqi teenagers, and the casualties were incredibly high. And it was 40 degrees or higher temperature, and you can imagine this body-strewn battlefield. And it was right after the fighting had stopped, and the Iraqis had won, if anybody wins anything like that. And so they were therefore redoing the earthworks so that the fortifications were being shifted in their favor. And they had all this huge earth-moving equipment, and they were just running over the bodies of these Iranian kids and mashing them into the sand. And Tony just told the bus driver to stop, jumped out of the bus, jumped in front of this earth-moving machine, and just yelled at the Iraqis that they had to stop doing this, that they had to at least collect the dog tags of the fallen so that at some point their families would know what had happened to them. And it was a crazy, quixotic, brave thing to do, but he stopped the earth-moving equipment, at least while we were there.
Your heart must have been in your mouth watching that.
I was a bit gobsmacked, actually. But, you know, I just admired that.
Did you both want kids?
We did in an abstract way, but we both felt that our work was incredibly consequential, and it was a great privilege to bear witness in this way, to be able to show how the crazy foreign policy decisions that are made in the White House actually impact real people's real lives. And that was the purpose of our work, and we were both engrossed in it. And so even though this was something we had thought about, I hadn't quite grokked that I'd already turned 39 when I was arrested by the Nigerian secret police doing a story about Shell Oil being in cahoots with the military dictatorship in Nigeria. And it was while I was lying on the concrete floor of this lockup in Port Harcourt that I realized that I was 39, and if we were going to have a family, I may very well have blown the opportunity if they kept me incarcerated for very long. And so when I was lucky enough to be deported after only 3 days, I came home with a new plan.
What a romantic start to a new life. How did having a family change your and Tony's writing careers?
Well, it changed mine immediately. I did not think I could be the kind of mother I wanted to be if I was going off on long open-ended assignments to places where you might get thrown in slammers or worse. So I gave up journalism, and then I had to think about what on earth I was good for, because that was all I'd been doing for a decade and a half. And it was Tony who encouraged me to try and write fiction. You know, he said, there's that story that you've always been intrigued by. Why don't you see if you can write it? So I wrote 3 chapters of what became Year of Wonders, and I sent it to my agent, and I didn't hear from her. And I thought, well, she hated it. I better go and try and convince someone that I can lie around a swimming pool and do a celebrity profile of Brad Pitt or something. And then about 6 weeks later, she called me and she said, "I've sold your book." And then I had to write the rest of it. And lucky for me, people wanted to read it. So I got to keep doing that.
How was that switch for you from bearing witness to fiction writing?
I think the bearing witness part made the fiction possible because I had this enormous range of human experience to draw on in order to create my characters, in order to do, when you're writing about the Civil War, for example, as I did a little bit in March, having been on that battlefield that was like a Civil War battle, it was like Gettysburg, young men running into guns. And the weaponry is different, but the effect on the body is the same. And having witnessed that, I could write it. And also seeing how people change when they're caught up in a crisis, some towards their best instincts and some towards their worst. And so I'm still living off the fat of those experiences as a journalist.
What about Tony? How did his career change?
So he kept working as a national reporter for the Wall Street Journal, and then he thought he would be slowing it down a little bit when we had Nathaniel, our first son, and so he went to work for the New Yorker, thinking that a weekly magazine would be a different pace, but it turned out to be, in many ways, much worse, just because the Wall Street Journal had come to trust his instincts and he could basically report and write whatever he wanted. But he found that at the New Yorker, they had a crazy idea that you should be able to tell them what the story would be before you'd reported it, and he could not get with that.
So what did he turn his attention to?
So he started writing. He'd written 2 books. One when he was a journalist in Australia and hitchhiked across the Australian outback, and that was his first book, One for the Road. And then when we were in the Middle East, before he was hired full-time by the Wall Street Journal, he wrote one of my favorites of his books, which is Baghdad Without a Map. So he had the experience and he knew he enjoyed book writing, but then he wrote one that was a huge success, Confederates in the Attic, which really got to his great passions of American history and how the fault lines in American society that were evident during the Civil War are still evident, and the arguments are still alive today. And so that book made it possible for him to then turn to full-time nonfiction book writing. So we had Tony doing He liked to describe himself as a reporter on the history beat in his books, and I was. He said I'd gone over to the dark side and started making stuff up.
Once you'd had kids, Geraldine, did you want to raise your children here in Australia?
I did. I wanted to raise myself here in Australia. I never intended to be an expatriate, but Tony was a more stubborn bastard than I was. And it was an argument I wasn't going to win because his work really relied on being in a place, whereas once I was writing novels, it's all in my own head, really. So I didn't have a very good case. And in any case, he was not yielding on that. So we ended up raising our kids on Martha's Vineyard.
Was Martha's Vineyard something of a compromise, between a big American city and Australia?
Well, he loved Martha's Vineyard too. He loved it when I met him, and I loved it as soon as I went there. And I'd had crazily, when I was 11 and living in Concord, Sydney, I wrote to a pen pal from the Mr. Spock fan club because we were both tragic Trekkies. And she spent half of her year on Martha's Vineyard in a little town called Menamsha. So I always wanted to see that. And I actually told Tony that before we were a committed thing. And he said he did a little happy dance because he was afraid that my pen pal was from some frozen corner of blighted industrial America. But instead it was this wonderful rural place. And it's a very misunderstood place. I think people think of it as glitzy and full of celebrities, but that's only for 8 weeks of the year. And the rest of the time it's just a beautiful rural, down-to-earth bunch of fishermen and farmers and construction workers and a few feckless artists.
Tony was on book tour for Spying on the South in May 2019. And you, of course, didn't know this to be the case at the time. But when did you last hear from him?
So I had gone down to Nashville. The writer Ann Patchett has a remarkable bookstore in Nashville. And he was going to do an event there, and she had the idea that it would be fun if I interviewed him for this event. So I went down there and did that. And we had a fantastic day and then evening and dinner with Anne and one of his oldest friends. And the next morning he was heading off to a sold-out event in Louisville, Kentucky, and I was heading home, and we said our goodbyes, and unbeknownst to me, that would be the last time I ever saw him.
Podcast and broadcast. This is Conversations with Sarah Konoski. You can find more conversations anytime on the ABC Listen app.
So, Geraldine, after this lovely visit together to Nashville, Tony was off on his book tour. Tell me about the phone call you got on the 27th of May in 2019.
That was, "Is this the home of Tony Horwitz?" And I said, "Yes." "Who am I speaking to?" "This is his wife." And then the news that he had died. And as bluntly as that, a very tired resident at the end of her shift 500 miles away.
Did you have much chance to get detail? I mean, that would have just been such a shocking thing to hear. What kind of conversation could you have?
Very little detail. She said there's here's the number of the doctor that's coming on, but you need to talk to the police, so they're going to call you. And then she basically hung up on me, and the police called, and then I called back the number she'd given me, and the other doctor was in the middle of somebody else's enormous tragedy, obviously trying to save lives, and he didn't have time or know anything about it. And I'm at that point already on the run to try and get off Martha's Vineyard on a holiday weekend to Washington, D.C. So I'm in motion. By the time I reach him, I'm on the boat. You have to take a boat to the mainland and then an Uber, and then I had to fight my way onto a flight on this very busy travel weekend, finally to get to the hospital where I wasn't allowed to see his body.
There's no good way to get that news, but that sounds like one of the worst ways you could get it. It's brutal.
It's a brutal system. I don't know at what point we got so callous. There's so many better ways to do it. I mean, as you say, there's no good way to get that news, but there are more humane ways. It would have taken 2 more minutes to find out the local police station in my town. Those people are trained in how to break bad news. And in my case, that would have been a great mercy, because I know most of those cops because they're coaches of my kids' after-school sports, and they would have known who I relied on, and it could have gone a very different way.
For you then, there was the burden of being the bearer of that news to other people who loved Tony. Where were your sons, Geraldine?
I had spoken to my older son just a couple of, maybe not even an hour before he was about to get on a plane in Manila. He'd just graduated from college and was on a trip with his girlfriend, and they were flying from the Philippines to see my sister in Sydney. And he called me before he got on the plane, and by the time I tried to reach him, he was already in flight. So I couldn't break the news to him. And then the plane arrives in Sydney, and he turns on his phone. He's got 2 missed calls from me and then a text from a well-meaning friend saying, "I really loved your dad," past tense. So that was how he got the news. And then my other son was just finishing up his year at boarding school. And so I called the principal of that school, and he arranged support as much as he could. And, I had this mad instinct not to call, to wait till I could be with him. But a friend wisely, who'd reached me by phone while I'm in the Uber, said, you have to call him right now because they live on their phones. What if he sees it online before you talk to him? And so that was smart.
But it meant you couldn't be there in person.
It was horrible. You're sitting in the back of an Uber and you have to tell your son, and he's our adopted kiddo. We brought him home when he was 5 years old, and this was not his first rodeo with grief and loss, and it was just brutal.
When I've been around other people who've lost a partner, it's really been apparent to me how much emotional work there is for that grieving person to do, having to receive everyone's condolences and plates of food and all of that. Was it like that for you once you made it to Washington?
It was surreal. There's just a deluge of things that you must immediately do. The business of ending a life, the bureaucracy of a life's ending. It just comes at you from all directions. And yes, the friends gather around and try to be helpful, but there's not a ton that anybody can really do for you in that circumstance.
The difference for you, I suppose, is that your beloved person was a public figure as well. So there was coverage of Tony's death in the newspapers and on TV. What was that like? In one way, it was wonderful to see him alive. That the night after he died, because he was on book tour, he was doing the rounds, and he was very much in the world. And they had a pre-recorded interview of him from the week earlier, and it was gorgeous to see him alive. And he's very good at interviews, and he was funny, but it was surreal. And the obituaries, they were wonderful. And there's a lot of consolation in that and a lot to be grateful for, because as there almost is every day in America, there had been a mass shooting the same day that he died. And I thought of all those people who'd lost their special person so suddenly in such a violent and brutal way, who would never have their loved one recognized for his wit and his commitment and his greatness in, major newspapers. And it was a wonderful thing for my sons to know how loved he was, even by people who didn't know him. Was it important to you to see his body?
Yeah, absolutely. And it was beyond cruel that it took so long to be able to do it, because, don't die on the street among strangers, because you will end up in the maw of the medical forensic system. They had to ascertain that there'd been no foul play. So he went straight from the hospital, where I wasn't allowed to see him, to the medical examiner, where I also wasn't allowed to see him, where I had to go in person but identify his body from a photograph, which I just thought was another unnecessary brutality. So it was days before I could actually hold his hand, and that was after his body had been released to the funeral director.
Were you able to speak with anyone who'd been there when Tony died?
Yes. People were extremely kind. The first person who saw him turned out to be a former medic from Vietnam, so I knew that everything that could be done was done. And then he collapsed right in front of a yoga studio, and all the yoginis came out and held him, and they had a defibrillator and the 2 ambulances, because he died right on the border of Maryland and Washington, D.C., so he had 2 crews there within minutes, but none of it was any use.
It was such a sudden death. Were there any red flags about Tony's health that you were aware of?
In retrospect, there were. So he had hereditary high blood pressure and high cholesterol, but so did his mother, who was in her 90s and still active at the time, and we had no reason to believe that those things wouldn't be as well managed for him as they had been for her. But he had complained of shortness of breath in a couple of occasions, but there were times when I thought, well, yeah, anybody would be short of breath. One was, he's running through traffic because he's late for a train, carrying his wheelie bag over his head. I thought, short of breath. But he was an incredibly fit guy. He went to the gym 6 days a week. And he went to see his cardiologist about that, and the cardiologist had recommended a full workup, but they talked about it and it didn't seem that urgent, so they pushed it off till after the book tour, and that was too late. He had myocarditis, as it turned out, which is not related to the cholesterol issues or the high blood pressure. It's an infection that anyone can get. You can get it from something as banal as the common cold.
And that's something you only learned after there'd been medical tests done after his death? After they'd done the autopsy. And, you know, it's not common, but it's not uncommon, myocarditis. And a third of people get it and they never know they have it and they recover. And the only way it's ever found out is the scar tissue on their heart if there's a postmortem. A third of people get it and get sicker and sicker and need all kinds of medical intervention up to and including a heart transplant. And then the other third, just like happened with Tony, that scar tissue interrupts the electrical signals and the heart just suddenly stops beating. What were you working on when your life was suddenly upended by this?
I was halfway through writing Horse, which was a book Tony really loved and was very involved in helping me with the research for, because he loved that period of American history so much. And so that went on hold. I could not think about that for about a year. It was a long time before I had any space to do the work of imagination again. But I did finally crawl back to my desk and finish it because he'd wanted me to write it so badly and I wanted to dedicate it to him.
Was there any kind of comfort of being able to escape back into that time?
When I could work again, that was really helpful. Work is now very important to me. I'm a much harder worker than I used to be. I find that is filling a lot of the space in my life.
What springs to mind when you think back to that book tour that you embarked on with the publication of Horse?
It wasn't just the book tour, my whole life. The first year is just a blur of frantic, busy work punctuated by abject misery. And then, you've got kids and you've got people in your life that you're responsible to. And so you start to try and do a reasonable impression of normalcy. And I realized 3 years into it that I had just been acting this role of woman being normal. And for me, that involved, being the secretary of the PTO and being a local conservation commissioner. And then it involved being an author on tour. But it was exhausting. And it was like I had to get in costume and makeup to walk out the door to assume this role of the normal woman. And I didn't feel normal at all. And so it was after that book tour, which turned out to be quite a long one because people loved the book so much, thank goodness, that I finally realized that I needed to do something, that I couldn't go on like that.
Other cultures, religious traditions are better at giving space and shape to grief than our modern medical industrial complex, including the Judaism that you converted to when you married Tony. What are the rituals for grief in Orthodox Judaism?
So, they've had thousands of years to work something out, and it's pretty psychologically astute, actually. Because we're not Orthodox people, we were not in a community that does this. But they have stages of grief and roles for everybody to play. And in the first 48 hours, that period is considered a time when you don't even offer the bereaved person condolences because they're not in any state to be consoled at all. So all you do is move quietly around them, trying to do the tasks that are necessary to get a body buried. And then there's a period of Shiva, which is a little over a week, where it's formal mourning, and the bereaved, there's a whole list of things that you do. You don't you cover the mirrors, you don't bathe, you don't do your hair, you sit on the most uncomfortable seat in the house, and you just reflect on the life of the person you've lost and accept visitors who come to condole you and to pray. And then at the end of that, there's a formal getting up from Shiva, and that's the first time you venture outside, and somebody walks with you when you do that. And then there's another 30 days of restricted activity. And then for everybody except the firstborn son, that's when you're supposed to get back on with the business of living. The firstborn son has responsibilities that go on for another year. That idea of more than a week of complete withdrawal from any responsibility, I think I would have benefited greatly from that. But if I had have done that, our credit cards were cancelled. Our health insurance was cancelled. There were a million things I had to do. I had to learn what Tony had been doing in our life for 35 years, all the things I hadn't had to give a thought to, like when are the estimated taxes due, all the things. And so, yeah, I didn't have 5 minutes, much less more than a week of quiet reflection. So 3 years later, I decided to give it to myself.
Why did you choose Flinders Island as the place that you wanted to go to withdraw from the world and finally be with this grief? Give it more than 5 minutes.
I knew I needed to get away from all my normal responsibilities, and I love Flinders Island. It was a place I'd been to with Tony. I had an idea for a novel, and we went there to do some research for it, and I just fell in love with the wild beauty of it. I love Tasmania in general, but Flinders Island is sort of like the essence of Tasmania.
Tasmania's Tasmania.
Yeah, Tasmania's Tasmania. And I talked to him about possibly buying some land there, and he just wasn't having a bar of that because he didn't want another thing that was going to attract me to spending time back in Australia. So it had been in the back of my mind as the road not taken. If I hadn't met and married Tony, maybe I would have ended up as an environmental activist, a cranky anti-development person in windswept, flannel-shirted Flinders Island. So it seemed like a suitable place. And it has such a remote vibe. It's quite a large island. It's a bit bigger than Martha's Vineyard, but it only has 900 full-time residents. So you can be very, very far away from everybody there.
I'm curious, Geraldine, because you'd had to go straight into this management mode, partly just to deal with the logistics and the responsibilities after Tony's death, and you'd had to keep feelings at bay to a degree, as you say, put on this costume of being a woman who's coping. Once you gave yourself this space, did those feelings surface easily, or how did it happen?
I needed to surface them because I'd suppressed them so intensely. I just needed to go back to the day when I got the news, when I didn't allow myself to fall apart. And the cost of that had become very high. So I needed to get back, remember what it was like, and allow myself the time and space to just quietly fall apart when it wasn't going to hurt anybody else for me to do that.
And how did you do that? How did you summon that moment 3 years before?
You know, it was kind of stupid that I didn't realize that I had this toolbox from the beginning, but a writer figures out the world through writing. So I wrote down everything I could remember. Every detail. I went back and tried to recall more and more details. And unbeknownst to me, this is the therapy that they prescribe for PTSD, is going back to the traumatic event and trying to recall it over and over again with as much detail as you can. So I was just basically self-therapying. And I would write for as long as I could, and then I would go for a bushwalk or a long swim, and then, you know, in the evening, the wallabies would all come around and I would commune with them. And so I was noticing everything about the island and writing about that too, the healing powers of the natural world.
I think there are many different feelings jostling under that umbrella term grief. What were some of yours?
I think the word lament really captures a lot of it. There's keening for the one you've lost and miss, that feeling of just incredible missing somebody, the broken heart feeling. And then what I was able to really do the work on was the grievance and anger and resentment part, because I had been wasting a lot of my emotional energy thinking about the life that I'd expected to have, that I wasn't going to have with Tony, all the images I'd had in my head of all the fun things that we would do, and having somebody with this incredibly long shared history and all the shared jokes, and watching our sons growing into honourable manhood together and taking pride in that. And just realizing that was gone. Those two rocking chairs watching sunsets, they're gone. And setting that down, that was, I think, the best thing that happened to me, was letting go of the life I wasn't ever going to have and just embracing the life that I do have. And going forward saying, this is what I've got and I am going to live it for the both of us, and I'm going to make it as vivid and as full as I possibly can.
As a writer, you had that means of making sense of your experience, or attempting to make sense of your experience through recording it in words. You also had Tony's words to kind of have a conversation with him almost, in a way.
Yeah, he had kept a journal for most of his life until he started full-time book writing, when I think now in retrospect, now that I've read his journals, because I never read them during our marriage, they were his private thoughts. And I realized after reading them that was where he went with his anxieties and his worries. That wasn't my sunny, funny husband. There's very little recounting of our great times there. It's mainly his dark nights of uncertainty. But there were really funny moments there where I learned new things about who he was before I met him that were unexpected and amusing. But yes, having his journals allowed me to learn new things about him, which I thought his death had robbed me of.
And he was someone who would make annotations in books, which means that you get to have a chat that way too.
I did not like this quality that he had, because I love my books, and if I get a beautiful first edition, I take the dust jacket off it when I read it and try not to read at the table and get food stains on books. But he just scribbled on them. He read with a pen in his hand. And I used to think this was a terrible bad habit, but now I'm really grateful, because if I pick up a book that he read that I haven't yet read, I can see what he thought of it, and that's a gift.
In a way, you got to have your goodbye with him in that time at Flinders Island in a way you hadn't at the time of his death.
I just allowed myself to, have all the feelings, all the emotions, and be a wreck for as long as it took to work through it. And so I feel like it was like I'd arrived with heavy bags, and I was able to unload one rock at a time, and I left a lot lighter.
You said that you knew one of the things you really came to understand in that time at Flinders Island, your own way of sitting Shiva maybe, was that you had to make a new life, not the one that you'd imagined or planned for, but a new one. Where do you feel you're at with that at this point?
I tend to say yes to interesting opportunities, projects. I am not afraid to take on work, and I really welcome it. I really want to be working very hard all the time.
That chance to be quietly with nature, that was one of the gifts that your time on Flinders Island gave you. Has that continued back in this work-focused world?
Oh, yeah. I think I am a ferocious noticer now. I really just I take the time to appreciate natural beauty and cherish it. And part of it is fighting for it, because we're at an incredibly precarious time. And all these things that bring me so much joy, the birds that come while I'm having a coffee, they might have a grape on the terrace with me, or just the new clutch of ducklings when they hatch, those fluffy little yellow impossibilities. They're so vulnerable to the depredations that we're inflicting on them. And I really just want to spend what time I've got left to try and help in whatever way I can for people to see what's at stake here, because really we are living through the most important thing that's ever happened to the human species on this planet. We are living on a planet that is hotter than any human being has ever lived on. And the costs to the other species that we share this place with are enormous. And we're going to wind up all alone, and then we're going to wind up gone if our politics doesn't change.
Among the things of Tony's that the hospital returned to you was the receipt from the cafe where he had had breakfast just an hour or so before he died. Has the suddenness of his loss led you to think differently about your own death, about this deep mystery that we all face?
I'm not a particularly woo-woo inclined person. I and Tony believe that it's over when it's over, but I think what I do embrace now is the amazing, extraordinary opportunity that we have to have been born at all, to be able to witness this astonishing creation and to do our small part to care for it.
Geraldine, thank you so much for being my guest on Conversations.
Thank you, Sarah.
Geraldine Brooks's memoir is called Memorial Days. We recorded this conversation on the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara peoples. Carmel Rooney is the executive producer of Conversations. I'm Sarah Kanoski. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Sarah Kanoski. For more Conversations interviews, head to the website abc.net.au/conversations.